Libraries Biodiversity. Good afternoon to everyone. We welcome you to the NUS Libraries Biodiversity Seminar Series. We are delighted that you could join us for this exciting event. Domestic Medicine in the Malay World by Dr. Faisa Zakaria is the first talk in this series. This will be followed by the talk titled Monkeys in the Garden by Associate Professor Timothy P. Barnard of the NUS History Department, which will be held on Tuesday, 18th May 2021. We hope you will all be able to join us then as well. I'm sure it will be another enlightening talk. The two talks have been arranged with the generous help of Dr. Anthony Di Medrano of Yale NUS College. And Dr. Anthony, can you just say hello to them? Yeah, okay. Dr. Anthony Di Medrano is the NUS Presidential Young Professor of Environmental Studies at Yale NUS College. We would like to express our gratitude on behalf of NUS Libraries to him for organizing both the talks. Dr. Medrano also kindly agreed to moderate our event today. Our speaker for today, Dr. Faisa Zakaria, is an assistant professor of history at Nanyang Technological University, where she researches on religion and ecology in maritime Southeast Asia. Her doctorate dissertation, Sacral Ecologies of the North Sumatran Highlands, was awarded the 2018 Arthur and Mary Wright Prize by Yale University and is currently being developed for a book with the University of Washington Press. Her talk today explores the traditional practices in the Malay world in the past using three source bases: Jawi manuscripts, children's books, and newspaper advertisements from the late 19th to early 20th centuries. Dr. Faisa will also introduce her ongoing digital humanities project that seeks to cross-compare such practices across diverse traditional medicine practices in the region. Today's session will be recorded and will be made available online. And now it's my pleasure to invite our speaker, Dr. Faisa, to share her thoughts on this fascinating topic. Welcome, Dr. Faisa.
Okay, thank you, Gandhi.
I will stop share now. Okay.
Let me just share my screen. Maybe before that, I'll just say hello to everyone who's here. Thank you so much for making the time to join me for today. And this is very much a discussion of work that's in progress. So in some ways, I'm not sure I have a lot of answers for everyone, but I hope that sharing some of the sources that I am dealing with, we could get a sense about domestic medicine in the Malay world, kind of the traditional medicine in the Malay world, and also I think raise questions about how this is related to diversity, given that this is a diversity series of talks after all. So biodiversity, I mean. Okay, so let me just share my screen, and I'm not very good at this, so let me just. Okay. Can everybody see? Okay, I think everybody would be able to see the screen. I'll just bring over the slide so that I can see it. And we can start. You might notice that the picture, I think, on the screen might not be what you expect. I think domestic medicine in the Malay world with all these funny connections. And I think what I'm kind of trying to signal through that kind of cover is.
Hold on, Faisa.
Wait a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There
I think
it is.
It doesn't come out.
Now it's there.
Yeah. Thanks. So I was trying to illustrate, I think, the ideas about connections, I think, being the main theme of this talk, and moving away, I think, from the kind of idea that traditional medicine, humanity concealed, that they somehow kind of comprises of the essence of a particular tradition and so on. I think most medical traditions, if not all, are in contact with one another, and that's kind of theme that we want to explore today. And in that respect, what we'll be looking at is some of the historical trends in medicine in the Malay world from the 17th to the 20th century. So I'll just give a quick overview of the literature that's out there. And position this talk, I think, in thinking about Malay medicine in domestic sphere, what would constitute the sort of features that will constitute a tradition, what are some of the interactions that are part of the tradition as well. And then we'll move on, I think, the second half of the talk to think about Malay medicine in the context of knowledge making with botany and the sort of picture of biodiversity of the plant world that we can get from that sort of discussion. And lastly, I will introduce a project that's just not just done by me, but led by a fellow colleague at NTU, looking into the idea of Malay medicine as a polyglot medical tradition, and thinking about how digital humanities can contribute to the discourse on Malay medicine, as well as raise new questions about it. So, oh yeah, one final thing is that even though I think, as Gandhi mentioned, that I thought I would be talking about a little about sources like children's books and advertisements, they are quite minor in this talk. That's because once I started thinking about the manuscript sources, I think they kind of overwhelmed they were kind of overwhelming in themselves. So we're going to focus, I think, more on the 19th century manuscripts with some attention, I think, to other kind of sources, but not as the main focus. Okay, so let's look at the literature on the subject, and I'm going to start with when do we start thinking about early Malay medicine? And I think that one date or one kind of starting point would be when sources started emerging, and one of the earliest sources is Busana Salatin, coming from Aceh as a kind of early source of anatomy, of explication on anatomy in the Malay world. So Busana Salatin, of course, as most those of you who are familiar with the tradition would know, was not primarily about medicine. It's really part of this sort of Persianate mirror of princes genre of text that talks about universal history, that talks about Islamic ideas on creation and what it means to be part of the creator and the destiny of the created. So history is presented as a part of a divine plan, and part of that divine plan involves understanding our own body. So one chapter, I think chapter 7, talks about anatomy and our understanding of it. So in some sense, that's some of the sort of earlier sources, and that's from the 17th century. So in the early modern period, we could see sources emerging about traditional Malay medicine being a part of a complex of traditions that is part of a humoral medicine sort of system, and it's integrated with this indigenous notion of how semangat or soul stuff inhabits the body and animates the different bodies, not just the human body, but also other bodies in the natural world. So sickness is not just an injury to the body, then it becomes a manifestation of a soul being sort of out of place, and that's a common idea in this region. So when we talk about remedies for sickness, it could involve, from the sources you could see, it could involve ingestion of herbal decoctions, application of poultices or medicine from plants as well as animal parts, and rituals, prayers, mantras, and so on. And often all of these sort of mix together, as we'll see in the examples that follow. Some of the early work was also done at the intersection of botany and medicine, where we can see these sort of two modes of knowledge making interacting and intersecting with each other. And some of this has been explored in the literature through the work, I think, which is wonderful, by Jeannie Wu, who talks about how George Eberhard Rumpius, for example, is part of this sort of inter-island information network that gets to know plant sources and at the same time its medicinal values. And Harold Cook, in his book Methods of Exchange as well, looks at how trade, especially informal collaborations that it engendered within the VOC, and that botanists and indigenous healers and so on help to generate both plant as well as medical knowledge. So the literature is somewhat limited at this point, but I think it's growing, and people are investigating these connections between botany and medicine in this early stage through a variety of sources. And when we come to the 19th and 20th century, the tradition and of course the meets with the modern, so to speak, and we kind of want to question the disjuncture between what's traditional and what's modern. But I think what emerges from the sources as well as from the literature is that you have the intensification really of a lot of the trends that's going on in the early modern period. So if we can characterize the 19th or 20th century as anything, it's really the period of intensification of contact that generated more written sources in Jawi Malay or in the Jawi script in Malay on medicine, including the surviving about 100 kitab tip, kitab ubat-ubatan, kitab ujarabat in libraries worldwide, majority of which was written down and repeatedly copied in the long 19th century. And part of the reason for that sort of generation was the colonial encounter and the interest from European scholars in this sort of text as well. So we have an intensification of writing. We also have intensification of botanical deconstruction, and that includes stripping down these recipes in this manuscript into its component parts, knowledge exchange, systematic classification that absorbs local knowledge and then translated them into scientific language, particularly the Linnaean taxonomical system. And we're going to talk about these processes later on in this conversation. So we also see domestic medicine coming into contact with not just with colonial authorities as well as colonial knowledge systems, but also with migrating communities. And I think an interesting dynamic that remains, I think, underexplored in the literature is how Malay medicine came into contact with Chinese medicine. And you could see changes, I think, in terms of how domestic medicine became sort of shifted away, I think, from not just being rooted in a particular community, but also came into contact with ideas like purchasing medicine from medical halls. And you see the emergence of over-the-counter medicine. So I've included a kind of illustrative example of how in the 1920s, for example, you can see a lot of different medical halls catering to the Malay market in Malay newspapers. So in the 20th century, you can also see a kind of sharpening divide between community healers, medical professionals, and the institutionalization of biomedical healthcare, as well as the emergence of hospitals. And traditional medicine, Chinese, Malay, or any other kind of sort of tradition, remained as a cheaper alternative to biomedical healthcare up to about the mid-20th century, but gradually became displaced as the primary healthcare system, as nation states sort of not only sought to modernize their political systems, but also their medical system, and that often includes a system that privileges biomedical healthcare. So in the sort of interstices of these transitions, Malay medicine sort of reinvented itself as a quasi-biomedical practice, but retained a lot of its plant-based recipes, displaced a lot of the sort of more spiritual traditions, but while retaining sort of an emphasis on touch, for example, in practices like massage. So I've talked about some of these trends, especially in the 20th century, in an early article, not that early, actually, in 2017 article with Maria Zainal, where we discussed sort of the development of traditional Malay medicine. And at that time, our argument was that the sort of harmonizing aspect of traditional medicine distinguished it from biomedical practices and enabled it to persist despite the hegemony of biomedicine in modern Singapore, albeit in a kind of altered form. And now that I read it again, I'm not entirely sure I agree with this, and this is something that we will discuss. In some ways, that assumes a kind of unquestioning acceptance of sharp distinctions that's drawn between traditional and modern, especially in terms of reliance with colonial interlocutors. So I am picking up again on this idea of, does Malay medicine traditionally emphasize balance and harmony, and some sort of prevailing ideas about why it does remain. So we could see a sort of emphasis on balance when we look at the spectrum of hot and cold, wet and dry, and the materia medica of the Malay traditional medicine is to be ingested. When we think about it in terms of the sort of humoral system that was in place, we could see kind of an effort at harmonizing when we talk about the soul of the semangat and the spirits inhabiting the natural environment, and how disharmony with them could cause sickness. And we could also see some of these elements in treatments that aimed at recuperating relationships between self and community, and that includes dealing with trauma. So, so there is a basis for thinking of traditional Malay medicine as a system that emphasizes balance and harmony. But at that, but I think we might also want to look at this a bit more deeply, and we're going to look at some of the primary sources such as Kitab Tip, Kitab Ubat-Watan, and Kitab Mujarabat that I mentioned just now, and see how these are articulated when we don't self-consciously reflect on it much. So when I was writing this article, I was basically writing it from a bunch of sources that step back to evaluate what traditional Malay medicine was. When we look at the sources of Malay medical manuscripts themselves, most of them don't sort of self-consciously think about themselves as a system. It's just mostly compilations of remedies and so on. And from these sources, I think we maybe will get a more nuanced view about what it means to, what Malay traditional medicine means, and if it does indeed emphasize balance and harmony, what does that mean in practice? So I'm focusing, I think, on Malay medicine and thinking about it in terms of the way it centers the home as well as the village to an extent on this as a site of healing, which is why I call this sort of tradition the kind of prescriptions and remedies they're focusing on as a form of domestic medicine. So, in general, we can define domestic medicine as practices within the home and passed on intergenerationally, aimed at preserving health, managing and preventing sickness. And this includes not just treatments for particular diseases, but also nutrition, hygienic practices, and taboo behavior. So it emphasizes both right conduct as well as possible treatment for different sort of sicknesses. And we find that, at least in the manuscripts I've read, there is an attention to children as a constituency, as a group of patients. And often a lot of remedies will take note that this condition is sort of specific to children, even for things like epilepsy and so on. So there's a difference between adult patients and children as patients. And I think that the attention to that sort of highlights the domesticity of the practice. So Malaysian scholar Harun Matpia, who's really prolific in sort of thinking and writing about Kitab Tip in Malaysia, broadly outlines what Kitab Tip deals with in his book, unfortunately not available in English. But I think at this point, the sort of broadest treatment of the subject in the Malay language literature. So he talks about how Kitab Tip both deals with diagnosis and herbal remedies, preventive practices, diagnosis of spiritual disease and ritual remedies, herbal remedies for chronic illness, dealing with small, minor, everyday things like cuts and bruises, management of sexual relationships within the confines of marriage, and nutrition and divination as well. So that complex of topics really sort of defines as practices within the home aimed at preserving health, managing and preventing sickness, and at the same time managing and preventing disharmony of social relationships as well. So when we look at Malay medical writings as a genre, and among the sort of almost 100 manuscripts that's available worldwide, there are varying degrees of survival in that sense. So there are full manuscripts where you have the author, the information, and the date, and it's like, great, it's a great find, but that doesn't happen very often. So one of the few, and we're going to talk about this also a bit more, is the manuscript Taib al-Insan fi Tib al-Insan, which basically means the sort of kindly goodness from human medical knowledge. And this is written by Sheikh Ahmed Al-Fatani and published in Mecca in 1895. And it's very interesting, partly because it's one of the few manuscripts that actually talks about what is tib and what it means. So maybe other manuscripts do that as well, but because the mukaddimah or the introduction is missing, we don't get to kind of compare this a lot. So in Al-Fatani's work, part of which has been transliterated by Effendi Muhammad Shafri and published by Academy Jawi Malaysia, he talks about the definition of tib, and tib in Kitab Tib basically means the knowledge of preserving existing health and returning lost health. So it can be divided into two parts, the first being beneficial knowledge like akhlaq or good character and all things that's related to it, and the second is all matters related to sort of physical healing. So here we see, at least at the end of the 19th century, kind of attempt to theorize what tib as a complex of knowledge actually means. And part of the reason was that Al-Fatani, unique to this manuscript, was writing in Mecca and also reflecting on this tradition as one that has sort of accreted influences from indigenous tradition, besides Islamic influences, and trying to, in some ways, cleanse it of hurafat. So his sort of reading of the sort of what tib means and what it should achieve is structured by that sort of objective. But it's a useful way for us to think about the sort of duality of tib, and that's basically the knowledge of preserving physical health and returning lost health, not only through physical treatment, but also through proper behavior. So there are other manuscripts that's less complete in their and the information that's available about them. So most are compiled, I think, as practitioners' manuals, so as a series of remedies and or as fragments with like no dates or no names of contributors. You just have like recipes kind of like listed down one after another, and we'll discuss some of that later on. Some are also chapters of other texts. We talked about Bustan and Salatin, of course, and then there's an interesting one which is incorporated in a story where a slave girl sort of impresses with her medical knowledge by answering the questions that's posed to her and eventually gaining her freedom. So, so it's very complicated in some ways, an interesting genre. So, when we think about Malay medicine, before we come to thinking about remedies and what is recommended for particular illnesses, what is interesting about at least some of the manuscripts in Kitab Tib in the 19th century, for example, this one also by a man in Patani in 1839, it discusses not just this is what we need to do in order for a certain outcome, but it also takes into account physician compatibility. So part of the introduction then speaks about what is the reality of treating the sick and the need for compatibility between doctor and patient. So so all tabibs or doctors should know the truth in divining the sickness of a patient, that if the sickness is not compatible with the doctor, that doctor or the healer or the tabib will not be able to heal it. So this emphasis on compatibility and not as thinking about sickness as a kind of isolated condition, but a relational one, I think is important in Malay medicine. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. So when we think about TIB, it talks about preserving health and returning lost health. So what is lost health? What kind of conditions are pathologized? What requires herbal medicines? What requires spiritual intervention? So to my mind, I think Matpia sort of, Harun Matpia, he sort of makes a false distinction, I think, between herbal interventions and spiritual interventions. Most in the manuscripts that I've read, the remedy that's recommended often involves both. So one interesting sickness, for example, includes addiction. So for things like opium addiction, here you have a kind of herbal remedy for that. You can take guava skin, green beans, rock, sugar, ghee, coffee, and opium. Follow the instructions and drink a bowl of this medicine to kind of deal with the urge to consume opium. But and you can deal with symptoms of opium addiction like chills and lethargy with the milk of young coconut and so on. But it also sort of goes back to the idea of needing a kind of spiritual intervention, needing help from God in some ways. And here that's recommended that you read kind of a passage from the Quran and dedicate it to a Muslim saint. So it's all of that sort of comes together in one paragraph, comes together as part of a complex of recommended treatment. So yeah, so to repel yourself from consuming opium, you can take the blood of an eel and mix it with opium and smoke it, and hopefully that will cure you from ever wanting to consume opium forever. Or you can write this first on a vessel and then wash it and drink, wash away the words and drink the water. So this is a very interesting sort of treatment that involves the power of language itself, that kind of it captures the nutritional quality of eating words, basically, or drinking words in this case. So, and those words are the sort of usually verses from the Quran, and in other cases, other types of mantras as well. So all these three sort of remedies are part of the sort of same recommendations in this particular manuscript. And even though opium addiction is something to be deplored or considered as a sickness, opium itself is also part of the Malay pharmacopoeia in that sense, and used as a medicine for hemorrhoids, eye and ear diseases, and so on. So another thing that you wouldn't expect, or at least I didn't expect when I was reading this, is like how much of the manuscript actually deals with how to stop a child from crying. It's like, and yeah, I have 4 nephews, and I can see why this is necessary, because upset children is really very hard to deal with. So some of them, again, you can see kind of layers of intervention. So you can give him a charm to wear, write this charm, for example, on a piece of paper. So this is from the digitized copy of the manuscript from the British Library, Kitab Ubat-Ubat dan Advertisements, from Pontianak in 1813. So here they talk about the azimat, or the sort of words that, if you wear it next to your skin, may sort of calm the child down. So that's one possible way of intervening. Another, again, is a kind of more captures a sort of herbal intervention. So take tempoyang, which is a sort of ginger, and crush it flat, extract the chow juice, apply it to the child so that he wouldn't feel sad. And this charm, and then you can top them up with the charm that's written on a lontar leaf and make him wear it. So, and some of them, again, sort of relates back to charms, and you can read out the sort of mantra without taking a breath, and let a breath towards the child, and then it would be afiat, which means all would be well. So all this sort of spoke to the kind of parental anxieties, as well as the variety of interventions that these manuscripts offer. So again, example of wearing of charms. So here is one manuscript from the National Library of Malaysia that we are transcribing in our team. And it talks about ini tangkal kanak-kanak ini 5 raja. So basically you have to write this figure and ikatkan, which is tied tangkal budak ini kepada lengan kanan ini rajahnya. So basically you have to write this thing 5 times, write the symbol, and then tie it to their right arm, and use that as a form of a charm. Again, attesting the sort of the power of the words and the ability to sort of wear words as well as eat words, and how that, in that sense, becomes a way of protecting the child from harm. Here, it's not specified exactly what kind of harm. It's not about feeling out of sorts, but a more general sort of protective symbol. And it's interesting that here, again, we see non-Islamic influences. So it's not all sort of related to Quranic verses and so on. Some of them, like these don't quite know exactly the origins for the type of mantras or type of figures that's considered protective. So again, sometimes going back to sort of the power of words, you don't really even need to specify kind of what you're suffering from. There are some medicines or some kind of incantations, some kind of charms, or some kind of recitations that was believed to be able to cure all ills. So for example, this Rawat, and here this is related to Islam and is connected to a Muslim holy man. And so if you recite it a number of times, 41 times, 100 times, and so on, then your troubles would evaporate. And not only will you not be sick, you will gain material wealth, have influence, and achieve all your aims. And for that reason, this is called Raja Segala Ubat, or the king of all medicines, in this particular manuscript, Compatibility, which has no author, unfortunately, and no place information, but roughly dates to the late 19th century as well. So again, it highlights, I think, both Islamic influences as well as the way in which these influences were articulated through the power of holy words. So for more sort of physical symptoms, one common condition, I think, that everyone who's Malay or even Chinese, I think, would be familiar with, is the idea of wind, and how wind could cause diseases and symptoms such as chills and aching joints. So here are some remedies or some herbs that's considered to be able to counter that by its sort of balancing of these sort of hot and cold properties. And the sort of householdness of this sort of remedy is sort of emphasized by the way in which it's measured. So if you're trying to carry this out, a ruas of water would be about one section of your index finger. So if you want to sort of measure, so you don't measure by ruler or by cm or whatever, but you kind of use a finger to decide how much water should you add to this particular mixture and so on. So it kind of I think illustrates the household everydayness of this sort of remedy. So eye disease, I'm highlighting this partly because we're going to talk a bit more about eye disease later on when we talk about perinatal medicine. But some of the ways in which treatments for eye disease, again, a huge section in a lot of kitab tip, indicating that this is a big problem in the Malay world, is to basically apply kind of herbal poultices or concoctions from animal parts if the plant remedies don't really work. And if your eyes, for example, seem to sort of weep yellow tears, I think because of secretions and so on, it might be caused by sort of internal imbalances in the body, and then the solution is to drink an emetic. And we'll talk about how this is a kind of common idea across different medical traditions. So the remedies for eye disease also include a number of taboos, like not eating chicken, not eating some fish species that's considered poisonous or detrimental to the eyes, and not to go for outdoor walks during the time, not to smell food when it's hot, and not to eat spicy or salty food. So it combines the sort of nutritional advice as well as behavioral advice with the herbal interventions as well. Okay, so yeah, so we have talked about, I think, some physical symptoms, problems within the household like crying children, and again, some of the a significant, I think, amount of material in the manuscripts also talks about spousal relations and how best to manage sort of relationships with your spouse. So that includes prescriptions for better sexual performance, such as maintaining erection, increasing sexual pleasure, and so on. But also for dealing with sort of relationship anxieties, for example, trying to prevent conception, which involves like placing a bed head under the pillow before the act, or preventing a wife from straying, or trying to find out wife's secret. So I think that at some point, there's a tendency to kind of like look at this and sort of laugh and say that, no, it's just superstitious. But I think what they highlight is not just about the sort of remedies per se, but the anxieties, I think, that surface from the sort of chapter which reflects the relationship, the sort of the way in which there are frictions within the households and how best to kind of go about managing those. And it's interesting for me, at least, to see how much of this sort of advice seems to be targeted towards men. And men's anxiety really for maintaining erection, for example, for preventing a wife from straying and so on. And we don't really know who was writing manuscripts for a lot of these sources. And in most of them that we do know, they tend to be men. But why it sort of started towards the point of view, I think it would be something that's interesting to think about. So there are also prescriptions for maintaining better appearance, hair loss, and getting better skin and so on. So one thing that, however, that do relate to women in the text is dealing with postpartum illness. And again, there's this is a significant section in almost all the kitab that I've read about 5 or 6. So that involves thinking about the dealing with the symptoms of postpartum illness, and that includes like fevers and chills, and also trying to engage with the patient who, if we were to think of it in modern parlance today, may be suffering from postpartum depression. And that symptoms are including disengagement with the child, not wanting to feed him, not wanting to play with him, not wanting to basically participate fully in the experience of motherhood. So in some of the texts, at least, and this is an excerpt from the Medical Book of Malay Medicine, which is based on an 1886 manuscript compiled by Ismail Munshi in Penang, talks about how Meroyan, or postpartum illness, was considered a kind of spiritual illness, and a lot of interventions seem to be geared towards trying to ward off the evil spirits that's causing this sort of behavior. So again, we kind of see two modes of pathologizing, right? When we kind of think about what are the physical symptoms and physical interventions that would take place, and another in thinking about how do we deal with the world of the spirits. Not unlike, I think, the differences between psychiatry and, for example, clinical medicine. So I hope that gives you a sense. Okay, and we're kind of more than halfway past the time given for this talk. I hope that gives you a sense of the way in which the text in Malay medical manuscripts sort of articulates ideas of sickness, what it considers to be lost health, and some of the ways in which remedies were recommended through this manuscript. So if I may sort of essentialize, it involves not just remedying physical symptoms, but also thinking about the welfare spiritually as well as socially, and remedying character, and not just intervening in terms of attacking individual conditions. So the medicine man, who also belong to this sort of complex community called Pawangs and Bumos, who have skills that is not just about healing, but also about mediating. So in a lot of communities, they play a bigger role sort of in terms of not just tackling physical illnesses, but also in kind of mediating differences within particular communities. And we can sort of see that, for example, Terence Davis' work recently on Miracles in Material Life, where you have Pawang and Bumos not just intervening in human illness, but also sort of communicating with, say, the spirit of Tin O and so on. So this sort of position, it kind of blurs the line between being a healer and being someone who could just interface with the spirit world is an interesting feature of Malay medicine. in the 17th to the 19th century. And we could see how these healers influences the social organization in the Malay world in some of these books by Hans and Vivek Nilakantan and so on, that kind of deals with how these traditions encounter modernity, and that's what we're going to look at next. Okay, but our focus in thinking about how systems of Malay medicines encounter modern knowledge making, I think for the purpose of this talk, is to look at how it intersects with the making of botanical knowledge. And here again, I'm emphasizing Malay medicine as an interconnected tradition. And it's interconnected through multi-ethnic encounters, not just in colonial societies, but also in migrant communities, interconnected through ecologies and the linkages you could see within different kinds of flora and some fauna as well, in the usage of not just trees or leaves and so on, but also shrubs, climbers, ferns and weeds, and the ways in which the usage of these plants impact the lives of other flora and fauna around them. Again, when we look at it in terms of knowledge making, we can see sort of a very intimate connection between botany and medicine. That's what we're going to explore. So from the end of the end of the 19th century onwards, we have a lot of lists of materia medica starting to emerge, I think, in publications, especially by colonial British scholars. So one of the early ones is by H.N. Ridley, who everybody knows is kind of the father of rubber in the region. And he sort of lists down Malay materia medica in this Journal of the Straits Medical Association in 1894, where he talks about how certain herbal remedies were used for particular diseases, as we've discussed just now. So this was expanded on, I think, in a work by Berkil and Hanif and Malay Village Medicine, which is published in the Gardens Bulletin in Singapore Botanical Gardens in 1930. And here, Berkil, of course, was the director of the Singapore Botanical Gardens. Hanif is a frequent collaborator, and I have to thank Anthony, who was kind of like drawing my attention to him. So he and Berkil, Hanif, often collaborated in terms of collecting specimens, and we can see the sort of productive partnership that they have in a way in which Malay Village Medicine was constructed. So the kind of modus operandi of collecting information about not just what herbs are used in what recipes, but also cross-referencing that to the Linnaean taxonomical system is done in the in this work by Berkil and Hanif. And they do that by contacting local interlocutors all over Peninsular Malaysia, asking them to bring specimens, and here's an example of a pressed specimen there, and taking notes about what this was used for medicinally. So here is a species of hibiscus that's collected now at the Singapore Herbarium and also highlighted in the latest issue of Garden Wines. And you can see in Jawi sort of writing on what this is used for. So this is a kind of this is used to combat against high fever, where you use both the shoots as well as the leaves. And you can see that, the flowers, sorry, not the leaves, the shoots and the flowers. So the corresponding entry in the Malay Village Medicine corresponds with this card completely. So that shows a kind of partnership between unnamed local Pawang, Hanif, and Berkil. So in that order of status. And Hanif was by no means the only person sort of involved in this plant collection process. So you have someone like Haji Muhammad Noor Muhammad Ghoz also kind of playing the same role as Hanif, and giving a few examples of of these men, and telling you why they're significant later on. So Muhammad Noor was born in 1898, became a herbarian and museum assistant, and took part in this sort of taxonomical organization project. So these are not men sort of associated with a kind of intergenerational passing of traditional medicine, but kind of stripping them down, deconstructing them, putting them systematically in place under a new taxonomical organization that's legible to colonial authorities. So he was particularly instrumental and indeed eulogized for his role in organizing all the specimens at the Singapore Herbarium taxonomically. And in his obituary, which is where I got information on most of these collectors, he was credited with sort of shining a light on the ways in which plants in the region could be understood in terms of this botanical system. So what's interesting also, and you can see that it's quite common as well, his son later took over his post and then became a research officer as well. And that's the same with another plant collector in the garden service as well, Ngadimin bin Haji Ismail, who was technically a plant collector for a while, but later put in charge of training monkeys in the garden to obtain coconuts. And that was a sort of his, he was eulogized for that special gift with the monkeys and being able to sort of take these risks. So you can see that the term sort of Malay plant collector is really very expensive. It covers a suite of different kind of duties. And I think Timana next week is going to talk more about monkeys. So I will stop here and on to another skill that you need to have as a plant collector, and it's art. So for example, this guy, Jeremy bin Samsuri, was initially hired as a plant labeler and then became the garden residence artist in 1942. I think they sort of skated over this in his obituary, but he did sort of work with the Japanese director in charge of the gardens during the war occupation. And his illustrations were used to create woodblock prints in the Japanese Mokuhanga tradition for scientific study. And you can see some display of some of his prints up in the Singapore Ethnobotany Center. So what we have that I want to highlight kind of through these examples, not just because, hey, it's exciting, people, they are Malay botanists as well, and I think there's no point, or there is little point in kind of thinking about this only in terms of ethnic diversity, but also what it shows, I think, about the nature of plant collecting as a job, and that's the way in which it covers a whole suite of duties such as taxonomy, animal training, and art, very much multidisciplinary, and blurring, I think, the lines between the amateur and the professional. So when you think about local knowledge and then expert knowledge, you would think of collaboration as I collaborate with local collaborators. So Burkill being that kind of person that people put in exhibitions and say, hey, this is a scientist in charge of the gardens, letting us know what is the what is our sort of plant heritage through his work in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. But working with him, I think all these men who were in some ways equally knowledgeable and also diverse and versatile in their skills. And I also want to highlight that they were all men, and it became a very much plant collecting, at least, is a very much a visibly male profession. And these men sort of interface with invisible collaborators who are both men and women, who all contributed specimens and I dedicated a little box for them. We sort of see the poem sort of drop out of historiography, drop out of the history of botany, but they were actually there in every single specimen. I think that maybe not every single one, but a lot of specimens that were collected and a lot of knowledge were because of this sort of invisible collaboration, or at least unacknowledged collaboration. And that distinction, I think, contributes to the sharper separation between the practice of botany, within the practice of knowing plants, and the practice of healing. And that's a very much a 20th century thing. But what surprises me was how the intergenerational aspect of domestic medicine, or in this case, domestic plant knowledge, remained, and a lot of, for at least 2 of the men here, their children were part of the garden service as well. So I'm highlighting that as a way to show the sort of trends in which the interlinked knowledge making between between botany and medicine operated, and the multiple collaborations that resulted from that. So when we want to reflect then, after we've generated all this list and the thought about this information, I think in a scientific way, how then do we kind of reconnect this to the ecology? So I think what is interesting about having lists really is that in some ways it obscures ecological interconnection. You have this herb, and this herb helps with this particular condition, and you just tie it to one particular condition and not to the place of that herb within a particular ecology. But if we were to move, I think, within the back to where that herb, that plant, that shrub, or whatever it is comes from, then you may have interesting stories about what will potentially be impacted if we use if anything happens to this herb. And here is one example. For example, the Akar Ketola Hutan, or the Aristoglochia of the Aristoglochia genus, in common parlance also known as the Dutchman's pipe. So this is a climbing plant, and its leaves contain an alkaloid that causes dilation of blood vessels and hemorrhage, and therefore considered quite poisonous. And interestingly, it is one of the sort of popular plants for which birdwing butterflies lay their eggs. And because their caterpillars have ingested toxins, you get this part of this orange sign indicating that there's a kind of poisonous substance there. So the plant itself was sort of from 1999 is banned in many countries from use in traditional medicine, even though it is quite popular in both Malay traditional medicine for combating fevers, and in China and in Africa as well for various different purposes. And it was banned for its toxic properties. But when we want to think about this from a conservation perspective, then what are the ecological implications for banning or categorizing certain herbs as useful or useless? And I think that's a question that sort of arises because when we look at how traditional knowledge systems are valued today, it tells us about how important it is for us to acknowledge that there are knowledge systems that unveils the usefulness of plants. But what if it unveils the harm that plants can cause? Right. So it was interesting to see, I think in the Singapore Botanic Gardens, the exhibition sort of starting off with plants that heal can also kill. So given the sort of dual nature, then how do we locate plants back into its own ecology? How do we value it? And if only the useful plants were to be cultivated, what would happen to things like the butterfly? So a lot of different questions. There's a lot of ramifications for how we want to think about evaluating the usefulness of particular species. So in some ways, the Anthropocene, or the era that we're living now in, is an era that's characterized by simplification of the landscape. And I sort of explore this idea about how some species in this sort of landscape are preferred over others when we talk about things like camphor. So in a separate paper, which I wouldn't dwell on, was we can see couple barrows, a very common ingredient in many Malay traditional medicine recipes, and native to Sumatra, Malaysia, Borneo, was quite difficult to cultivate, but very much valued for its medicinal properties, and it's now quite endangered in the wild. And its absence, however, is not really a miss, and that's something that's interesting, partly because the way in which one could cultivate a different kind of tree, which is relatively more relatively easier to cultivate, relatively easier to manage, and exploit that for camphor, not of the same quality, not the same kind, but having some of the sort of similar properties. So this camphor tree is native to Japan, Taiwan, China, but you can see them sort of in Southeast Asian botanical gardens, partly because of Dutch and British interest in cultivating this tree for a growing market in camphor in the 1920s and 30s. So what does that mean again? For if we have this preference for particular species to be reproduced worldwide, can we trace the histories for which species it's reproduced, how and why, and what is whether they're missed or whether they're not? So we can pick up on this idea of species exchange across geographies through medical sources as well. When we think about how medical traditions move with communities. So Hooper, I think in 1929, again in the Guardian's Bulletin, talks about how drugs of Chinese pharmacies in Malay are slightly different from drugs of Chinese pharmacies in China. And one of these entries, for example, illustrate how some plants that grow in China, when brought over to Malaya at that time, and grew somewhat differently. So here, this particular plant initially in China has a milk white root. The Malayan sample has long, dense, light colored roots. The color sort of slightly changes. So what does it mean to have non-native species that grow in a different setting? And how does that impact the development of the species itself? I think historically this question has not really sort of been interrogated, and I think pharmacopoeia might provide an entry point into that. How does this impact, how does this movement impact other species? And we can see that when we think about migrating Chinese communities, they not only migrate and bring along ideas of medicine as well as new plants, but they also may have to come to a point where they localize their Chinese recipes that they brought from China and use materia medica in the neighborhood. And that's an area that will be useful to explore. So that brings me to the last part. So the project that my colleagues and I and TU are interested in exploring is precisely dealing with the sort of interface between Chinese and Malay medicine. And some of the sort of ways in which we can see hints of these traditions interaction could, for example, come with looking at some sources coming from Peranakan families. So here we have a set of one of the sources that we're fortunate enough to have was donated by a Peranakan family in Singapore, and it captures a bunch of family recipes that were recorded in what the Peranakans call a yolk tua, or the Hokkien word for medicine, and being yolk and tua being record. And interestingly, many Peranakans were more conversant in Malay rather than in Mandarin Chinese characters. In pencil, you can kind of see annotations in the Malay language. So in this case, Obat Kong of dealing with wind, Budak-budak, which is for children. So you have the recipe sort of written in Chinese, and when the caregiver and the family sort of wants to use this prescription, they bring it to a Chinese medical shop, they will find all these ingredients and cannot make up the prescriptions themselves. But it's understood and recorded and thought of in terms of the family in Malay, which is sort of interesting. So I tried to sort of look at what are similar, for example, eye wash, right? Does this sort of map into some of the recipes that we've seen in Kitab Tip? And interestingly, not in terms of specific ingredients, but in terms of general prescription. So here you have for eye wash, for example, the use of flowers, these three flowers, or of zinc, as well as an emetic. And when you look at recipes for eye wash in Kitab Tip, for example, the flowers are different, but you do have flowers combined with water boiled in a kind of copper pot that kind of to infuse the sort of metal minerals, and also an emetic. So some of the similar principles there. So which raises some questions about what if some of these herbs, most of them native to China are not available, what will be used? And what is valuable enough for people to try to cultivate here. So again, if you look at advertisements, you can see how Chinese medicine is kind of marketed towards the Malay market, and we don't know much about the processes of understanding this process as well. So how did Chinese medical halls learn about the framing of diseases? What are the kind of cross-cultural influences in that emerge in the commercialization of tonics and herbal remedies? How does that change the domesticity of the medical practice in the region? And these are the sort of interactions that we are hoping we might provide some tools to explore. So how do we investigate influences across different cultural traditions, particularly Chinese and Malay? And some of the tools that can be provided by digital humanities in general could be involve making manuscripts online, looking for linguistic synonymy and searching for common ingredients in particular diseases, recipes, mapping of geographies, and so on. We don't have much time to do this, but there are a few databases that already sort of have some of this information in terms of at least generating plant names, relating that. I think this is an interesting database that focuses on how prophetic food sort of emerges in, or foods that are valorized in Islamic literature sort of emerges in Malay Kitab and so on. So some of that efforts have already sort of are in place. What we're trying to do is sort of build on those efforts by bringing together a selected corpus of Chinese, Malay, Abui in Eastern Indonesia, and periodical medical manuscripts of family recipes, and under the umbrella of a common website, and provide tools for transliteration as well as generating a plant synonymy across history languages and incorporate them in kind of larger databases such as that in the Kew Gardens. And what we hope to achieve, and this is very much a work in progress, is that by next year we have a system which will enable a kind of cross-linguistic search across these manuscripts in the corpus. So if you type for something like ginger, you can find out how ginger is used in Chinese recipes, Malay recipes, Abui recipes, Peranakan recipes, and then maybe get some insights from there. And eventually also use software to kind of map the localities of different drug recipes that we have in the corpus. So this is very much a work in progress. We're kind of calling this polyglot medicine before I realized that Berkil and Gimlet also thinks Malay medicine is somewhat polyglot. So yeah, it's nice to know we think alike. So yeah, so some of the, I don't think in some ways this talk as an argument is really very much very show and tell kind of discussion. But if we are to take away sort of anything from discussion, I hope that what comes across is this idea of Malay medicine as an interconnected tradition, both ethnically as well as ecologically. And then we need at some point to think about comparisons and new tools for those sort of comparisons. And thinking about the practice as domestic as generative, as we think about social history and how these sources could help us understand social relationships, anxieties, the difficulties, the challenges in managing them in the household, the village, and the community. And the practice of, I'm thinking about medicine as domestic as well, highlights the close relationship between gendered practices of domestic medicine and the development of botanical knowledge making that's sort of erased when we think of botany as just an expert scientific field. And lastly, when we think about conservation of plants and based on indigenous tradition and its value in the indigenous tradition, we also need to take into account not only sort of the properties of the plant itself, but where it's located in the landscape, its role in the sort of landscape we're envisioning and simplifying in some ways. How would that impact other useful or non-useful plants? And those sort of evaluations need to be done with more nuance. I'll just end with a shout out to the people that are working on the digitization project with me. That's Michael Stanley Baker, who's working on Chinese manuscripts, working with me in NTU, and also in NTU, Francesco Chachafoco in looking at Abui manuscripts. Yeah, a lot of our work in terms of the digital back end is done by Makalin Goodman and managed by Sharif Bandu Al-Habshi and Shudodo. We're fortunate to also have the help of some transcribers from Kumpulan Pencinta Jawi in Singapore who are helping us with some of the manuscript transcriptions. And also want to thank, of course, Martin Loh and Anthony Medrano for drawing my attention to Singapore Botanical Gardens. I think they shared a lot of interesting stuff. And to Nur Huda and Muhammad Azmil Razif, who are running the NACE, or the kind of prophetic foods and Malay medicine website in University Science Islam Malaysia, which is really worth checking out. Yeah, so thank you. I hope that there will be time for discussion, I think more for comments as well as questions. And I'll hand this time over to Anthony.
Thank you very much, Faiza. That was lovely. It was a really rich, I think, tour through the biodiversity heritage of the Malay world by using kind of plants and medicine and the intersection. So a really kind of innovative and I think productive exploration. I've got some questions and comments, but I think it might be more appropriate for me to open up first to everybody. And again, as Faiza said, it could be reflections, comments, questions, clarifications. It's kind of whatever you have on your mind. Is that okay, Gandhi, if we open it up?
Can.
And what's the time that we have, just so everybody knows, Gandhi?
We can take another 10 questions.
Okay.
Yeah, we can go for another half an hour if you have a time. Yeah.
Okay, so till about 4:30 then.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's, I can't see everybody because we've got a pretty big group, but you could message me or raise your hand or turn your mic on and just sort of start to shout, and I will draw attention to you. So do we have any questions to begin?
Prof. Medrano?
Oh, Amaral, yes, please, go ahead.
Sorry, may I present my question?
Yes, please do.
All right, thank you, Prof. Faiza, and thank you, Prof. Medrano, for moderating this session. I was just noting throughout the presentation that a lot of the medicinal terms that were mentioned are kind of rooted in a lot of Islamic terminology as well, like reference like akhlaq and like kurafat. I was also wondering where is the place of like animist peoples, animist Malays, so like non-Muslim Malays in Southeast Asia. How did domestic medicine like kind of overlap with the Islamic medicine, or did they kind of develop separately in a sense? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great, and I think it's always a complicated question. I think part of by highlighting, I think upfront the Patani manuscript from 1895, for example, that sort of centralizes Islamic vocabulary in some ways. But there are other manuscripts in which the origins of where you can see sort of the terms sort of alluding to other traditions, and specifically, I think some Hindu Buddhist gods. I didn't include the incantations here, but there are quite a lot of those where they talk about, oh, saya tahu asal sesuatu, or I know these kind of origins of certain things, and those origins sort of root back into kind of Hindu Buddhist kind of complex of beliefs, and those sort of mantras and are also quite a common part of a lot of kitab tip. So the ways in which, for example, I think when I talked about MS47 and the sort of Raja or the kind of diagrams that I use as Tangkal or Azimat, those sort of interventions also allude back to a kind of a belief system that is pre-Islamic. And for some people, for example, the author of the 1895 manuscript, they found it necessary to cleanse this, the wisdom of this man, to take the best of these manuscripts in some ways means to take the Islamic parts of it. And I think in some ways that is also the thinking behind the website that's run by University Science Islam Malaysia as well. When you think about how does Malay manuscript sort of jive with what we know from Islamic sources about prophetic foods. Sorry, I didn't have a chance to kind of show that to everyone because of the lack of time, but yeah, you can sort of explore that on your own. There is a very, in short, I think there is a very tight connection between understanding of Malay traditional medicine in terms of Islamic beliefs about medicine. But I wouldn't say that Islamic beliefs, for example, displaces earlier traditions. I think that often in the sources that we find in these Malay medical manuscripts, they would appear side by side. And if they don't appear side by side, that's usually by kind of self-conscious stepping back, I think, from that sort of pre-Islamic tradition. Yeah, so I guess and this is very related to historians, the answer really is, a lot of it depends on which manuscript you're looking at and the context of it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amrul. Amrul's going to be now a fourth-year student at Yale and US College. Amrul, I'll introduce you. I mean, you should connect with Faiza, because Amrul's also on a kind of the Duke, the NUS Duke medical track to become a doctor.
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, I should definitely connect.
Yeah. Excuse me. Let's see, any other questions from the audience? I've got one that I'll jump in. I think it's somewhat similar to Amrul's, and I want to ask you to think a little bit about the manuscripts. So you mentioned the ethnic interactions, or the connections that we could see perhaps between Chinese and Malay, but I was curious about if we kind of nuance or unpack Malay. Do we see any trace of, again, because plants have, you know, various ranges, and what we might find in Padang or West Sumatra might not be the same thing that we find in Pahang or Kelantan. So I'm curious, from the manuscripts, are we able to sort of tease out whether there's a kind of Bugis element or a Bhutanese element or a Minangkabau element or an Achinese? Is that kind of ethnic detail, does that come through at all through the plants, or not so much?
I haven't done the necessary comparative work in order to make an informed answer about this, but you're pointing, I think, to a very important question. I say not to essentialize, I think, the term Malay and the Malay world, right? So I think if you think about someone like Russell, and I know that you're the Russell expert, so you want to jump in here. I mean, you can think about the region really as a kind of two different biotic zones, right? And the kind of plants that's available in one part, they say the sort of so-called western part of the Malay world might not be the same as the sort of eastern part. To at least in the sources that I've read, I think that there is no sense of geography in that sense. It's really about use these particular things to have this particular impact. But what's interesting, and I think it's well worth exploring, is how there are often many different remedies for the same condition. So for example, eye disease, right? There's like, I don't know, maybe about 20 different recommendations for what you can do, and they're not linked together. So what is worth exploring could be how this sort of accretion of accumulation of remedies for particular treatments emerge, and whether that becomes because of interactions, because of movement within the Malay world itself. And I think, yeah, that's a question that in some ways I'm not qualified to answer, but I hope in some ways that the comparative tools that we would generate can enable kind of preliminary answer at some point in time, especially since I think the corpus that we are trying to access, which is kind of put on hold because of the COVID situation, stretches, I think, from Peninsular Malaysia as well as to Eastern Indonesia, and it'll be useful to kind of look at similarities and differences. But even something as simple as, say, comparing the Patani manuscript with the Pontianak one would be generative. And yeah, I haven't done it well, so I'll get back to you when I do.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it, Faiz. I think it might not be so clear in the remedy, but it might show up once you sort of do once you process the manuscripts and you identify the botanical sort of references, then perhaps that mapping and geography might show itself. And yeah, and that's exciting, though. I think what you're striving to do. So the interactions, not just between sort of these large communities, Malay and Chinese, but also perhaps the movements within those groups and their own senses of difference. And yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks for the great question. And I think, yeah, it's a useful reminder kind of not to, I mean, can we really, I think we might want to question ourselves, so can we really speak of a Malay medical tradition? I think in the end, that's a question that's well worth asking.
Yeah, that's a great one.
And I haven't come across anything from Padang actually. So if anybody knows anything from Kitab Tip from West Sumatra, I'm very interested.
The other thing, I mean, with Hanif, it's that there's a very large and active Achinese community and in Penang, and so he's drawing on what Burkill is calling Malay medicine, which in fact might be, perhaps more Achinese medicine that's kind of existing in Penang and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And I think when you look at the specimens, right, it kind of that he collected, they sort of skew towards North Malaysia quite naturally, right? Kedah, Lusta, and that sort of region as well. So that sort of makes sense when you think about Penang as kind of being the center of generation, both proximity to Aceh as well as proximity to Malaysia.
Yeah. Thanks, Faiza. Let's take another. Oh, sorry, there's some people with questions. We've got Anu. Do you want to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I was very, I liked your paper a lot. I was wondering to what extent you also make connections with the Unani medical system, the Ayurvedic medical system. And what I know from those working on that is that there is also a rethinking of disease and what it means, to be a certain kind of person. And therefore the importance of traditional healers and where do they fit in this whole scenario. So I just wish you had spoken a little more about, this relationship that one has, not just with one's environment in relation to the kinds of plants that might heal us, but to the kinds of ways, what is it that heals. So I would have been curious to know a little more about that. Thanks.
Right, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think the focus on plants partly, I think, links also to the theme of biodiversity that kind of defines this seminar. But you're absolutely right. I think that the way in which we can think about Malay medicine as a system, I think, has more resonance with South Asian medical systems. And I think that is well worth comparing as well the kind of Ayurvedic traditions, not only in terms of the sort of remnants of deities that sort of finds itself in the mantras, but also the kind of what is defined as right behavior, right? And that's often couched in Islamic terms. So I think what is interesting, I think, in these manuscripts is that as pointed out by, I think, Amirul just now, the vocabulary is Islamic, but the ideas, I think, may not necessarily just belong to sort of one religious tradition. So I haven't done the sort of work in thinking about Unani Ayurvedic thing. Is that I would love to sort of see how this sort of broader comparison could be facilitated, I think, in the future. And if you could share sort of more also about this system, I would love to sort of get in touch.
Yeah, just a follow-up thing. Actually, I'm interested in mental health issues in relation to what is now called eco-psychiatry. So how the forest or wild animals affect people's perceptions of who they are and how they see well-being in Bengal. So this is why I was interested to know more about sort of ways in which people understand disease and afflictions.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to have a discussion.
Yes, we do.
I guess, by the way, it's a wonderful book. I enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
And and I think that some of the, when you talk about mental health issues and sort of the way in which well-being comes into the manuscript, I think the most obvious thing that sort of popped up to me is the way in which a lot of these manuscripts sort of pathologize mental illness as a kind of disturbance of the spirits, right? And in this sort of broad way. And and how that was managed, strangely for me at least, it feels a bit discrepant that you have at one point physical remedies, kind of a herbal remedy, please take this or whatever it is. You have also at some point mantras, say this over this person's body, or smoke this over this person's part of the body part, and so on. But the way in which understanding, I think, where this person is coming from, the condition, what is motivating that sort of behavior, does not seem to be part of the healing process, at least from the manuscripts that I've read. So when you think about mental health, then in terms of intervening as a way of understanding the mentality of the patient, the way in which certain conditions or certain situations in a person's life influences parts of behavior, that does not seem to be part of the discourse, at least not in written tradition. So yeah, and I think that's a kind of
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting kind of gap in kind of treatment of mental health. And I would love to know, I mean, what emerges in Ayurvedic manuscripts and whether this is dealt with in a different way. And yeah, it'd be so fascinating. Let's definitely talk more.
Thanks, Anu. Thanks very much. We've
One
got
more
a
question. Yeah, from Elspeth Opperman. One more question.
oh, we've got actually Cheryl Teo is waiting first, and then we'll go to Elspeth. Cheryl, how about you go first?
Hi, I'm Cheryl. I'm a third year anthropology student. Thank you, Prof, for sharing your work. I was just wondering, because so in medical intro, one of the kind of key themes is always how the practice of medicine, or like the practice of kind of like healing, doesn't always conform to medical principles, whether it's biomedical or traditional. And I was wondering if in your work you found any, in your research, whether you found any kind of examples of this divergence from what's written down in the manuscript. And how would you go about kind of looking for those divergences, since it's precisely because they're not being written down, or like that's what people are doing in their own homes? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it reminds me of two things. First is what is observed by colonial sources on these medical traditions and what is written down in terms of the kitab tips. For example, about crying children, right? So you have all this, give them some herbs to drink and so on. And at the same time, you have observations of how, for example, Ridley, when he talks about his Materia Medica, the Malay Materia Medica talks about how people dealt with crying children by kind of smoking them, kind of putting them in kind of a swing, and then smoking them kind of holy, through kind of lighting a fire and everything, kind of like enveloping them in kind of smoke that is that's kind of that's generated from burning some incense as well as herbs, and then saying mantras over them that doesn't seem related to those in the Tangkal and the Azimats and so on. So these sort of discrepant observations, I think, between different sources and different interlocutors are well worth exploring. Another issue, of course, is postpartum depression. That was something that, for example, Gimlet wrote a lot about, and his writings differ from some of the observations, from some of the recommendations or prescriptions in Kitab Tib. So one of the things to observe, for example, was how in terrible cases of Meroyan, sometimes the woman is sort of isolated or kind of put by herself in a particular position, in her body position in a particular way that's considered to be healthful or kind of generate a kind of healthful benefit. And in least one case, I think the patient died from this. It is in his case observation, that the sort of treatment caused the death of the patient, and that doesn't appear in Kitab Tib. So I think looking for different sort of sources and how they make different observations, I think to some extent we are careful about the use of colonial sources because they are not sort of in a way they are looking for the spectacular. They are looking for how the white man can intervene, but But I think that the way in which these sets of sources could be put in conversation might be productive in terms of looking for discrepant medical practices.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Cheryl, for your question. Thanks, Faiza. We've got Elspeth. Elspeth, you're next.
Thanks. Actually, I think you've probably addressed my question somewhat in your response to the last two, but maybe just to put a finer point on it. Thanks so much for this sort of wonderful linguistic and discursive analysis. And you've responded a little bit to questions about behavior and positioning. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about touch, because at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned touch being a really key part of the medical practice. And in relation to that, what the limits are of a digital archive that is primarily linguistic and written, and whether there are ways that you're looking at getting around that to talk about sort of physical practice, touch, even potentially, do you talk to sort of contemporary practitioners of this medicine about, you know, those kinds of aspects of medicine as a practice that maybe exceed the linguistic or the written? Yeah.
Great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for asking this, Elspeth. So about touch, how does touch emerge in Kitab Tip, right? So I think what remains of touch now, when you think about the practice of Malay medicine in contemporary times, we think of, first of all, I think of massage, of the way in which you try and get regulated your kind of circulatory system going through touch. But I think that in the manuscript, what comes across is that what is being touched, for example, like letters kind of play, charms placed against the skin, how you place it, the positioning of the body, all those sort of in some ways come up as well. So in not in a kind of obvious way, but in the way in which it's recommended for certain times of the day, you should place your body in a particular position as you drink this particular herbal remedy, for example. So, or as you should place, for example, the charm on your right hand, or you should blow towards a certain direction in the body, or certain body part at that time. So these are all sort of indirect ways in which touch becomes incorporated into the corpus of prescriptions that could intervene and that could make up an intervention into a particular treatment. And those sort of things, this sort of orientation, frequency of touches, or ways in which we can focus on specific parts of the body, that's sort of lost in some ways in contemporary practice. And so kind of moving on to your next part of the question, those are the parts that kind of people tend to dismiss as that's just superstition. You know, it doesn't really matter what position your body is in, doesn't matter where I'm touching this, where I'm applying this particular salve, is it going to be, you know, clockwise or anti-clockwise? That doesn't seem to matter anymore. So, which comes back to, I think, your second question then about limits of documentation. Then how do we what basically are the limits of documentation? I think you're absolutely right that if we study contemporary practice, that would really help in seeing how this tradition becomes reinterpreted in contemporary times. And that's something that we are planning to do in the next semester, actually, by contacting both Chinese as well as Malay medical practitioners, and hopefully working out ways to get ethnographic videos of some of the ways in which they put this in practice. So how is that going to be integrated kind of within such functions and kind of linguistic explorations? I think it's something else altogether, but I think it's definitely useful to have a kind of vision about the materiality, I think, of the way in which these prescriptions are carried out. So yeah, thanks a lot for highlighting that. I noticed that there's a quick question from Surya Kencana Umar, which I can't answer, so I feel very bad about the interface of Javanese traditional medicine. So I'm not, sadly, because I don't read Javanese explore the Javanese traditional medicine or Surat Centini. So I feel very sad not to be able to say that. Yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything useful about that. But I would like to talk with you about your work about that and see whether it's possible for a broader integration into Javanese, whether our tools will be possibly integrated into this. Yeah.
Maybe we could ask Omar. Yeah, Omar, do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on your question so that I think your mic's on, and maybe Faiza could. I'm sorry, you're muted.
Is he muted? Okay, no, I think he's not.
You're no longer muted. I think you're good now. Yeah. We can't quite hear you yet, Omar. No.
So I think do you, I can send you my email and we can talk more about this, I guess, since we are also running out of time. But
Yeah, why don't we do that then? Omar, if it's okay, Faiza will drop her email to you, and then you guys could have an additional conversation about this. I mean, it sounds like you've got an interest, Omar, in Javanese traditional medicine, and that would be probably very productive for Faiza, who's looking at sort of Malay manuscripts. So perhaps you guys can exchange emails and pick that thread up. Would that be good for you, Faiza?
yeah, I will send a message to. I'm trying to find it here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
His mic is out. Yeah.
Oh, her mic.
Okay. Thank you so much for attending this session. I hope it was fun and useful.
Yeah, thank you, Faiza. And I want to maybe just as I say one final thought or close, I found what was really interesting too is just the incorporation of non-native plants into traditional medical practices. So things like chili and tobacco and other things that sort of make their way into Southeast Asia, then get incorporated into these traditional practices. And I think that's pretty fascinating in itself. And it kind of does speak to one of the biodiversity questions you raised in terms of the implications. And this would be less implication and more just adaptation, at how communities, local communities, people move, species move, but the medical practices and the medical knowledge seems to very much adapt with that. It looks like we might have Omar. Are you back, Omar?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Because I came to this talk rather curious. One of the things that I've been doing is trying to promote the idea of the kitchen as a pharmacy, something based on a traditional Malay or Javanese kitchen. And hence today's topic kind of interests me, talking about domestic medicine. My mother is some would call a traditional healer. So I grew up in an environment where there are many people who came over to my house to get healed. And that is where I could touch a bit about what was the question earlier about touch. Because one of the things that my mother taught me about the importance of touch is to prevent the misunderstanding that you are the person with the power or the ability to heal, whereas the healing comes from God and things around. So if you can heal a person without touching, it can create that kind of thought that you are super powerful or something like that, and something that she as a healer, she tries to avoid. So she says, she taught us that even if you're able to do it, the touch is important because it also creates the connection. Because personally, when I massage others, I need my hand to read the vibrations of the body in order to do that. Without touch, I will not be able to get a feel of which are the touch points that I need to press in order to help the person that I am working with. So that is what my mother has taught us about touch. So the only other person who has continued my mom's legacy is myself, partly sharing the knowledge on jamu, and my sister, who has now incorporated the new things that she learned on pre and postnatal massage. So she has brought in what we have learned from our mother, and then now she has incorporated new and contemporary methods in order to make sense of the various practices. And with the question, I think, about the idea of the written tradition versus the oral tradition, from my own research, for my master's thesis I did on the traditional rituals in Central Java, Surakarta. One thing I learned is that the oral and written tradition come side by side, where the oral tradition will take off quite fluidly, but whenever there is a dispute or debate, then we will look at the written documents to verify and to kind of strengthen that knowledge. So that's why I observe the strong interconnection. However, of course, one of the things I noticed in Singapore with respect to the Jamu families is that there seems to be a discontinuity. For me, I'm fortunate that just before my mom passed away, we managed to get some interest and get certain things going. But from others' friends is that they had to rely on, there was a disconnect where the mother did not continue from the grandmother, and then now they have to look back from various relatives to get the resources in. So there is still hope, because I think there are quite a number of families that I know that have revived their family traditions. And even, for example, a basic formula like kunyit asam, it varies from family to family, although the basic ingredient is just turmeric and tamarind, right? But in every family will have their own take. So that is where we see what is written and then what is being practiced, and how it differs. And a lot depends on actually what is available in the immediate vicinity of the house, right? Hence my mom always inspect my kitchen when she was still alive to make sure I have some basic things there. So every time she comes down, there's always an inspection to make sure all my spices are there, all my herbs are there, all the basic roots are there. And this is where I realized that such tradition doesn't carry on so much within the community these days. And hence my interest to get back into this and try to pick up as much as I can.
Yeah. I just maybe 2 points too, because we're running out of time as well. I wish, I dream of finding a way to find a source where we can actually see what a kitchen garden in the past looks like. And I think you're right that maybe part of the reason why there's so many different alternative remedies for certain conditions is because of the way that the tradition adapts to particular localities. And I also love what you said about touch as well, and how there's a kind of discrepancy between practice and written sources as well. And it highlights, I think, that the tradition of kind of using touch to intervene in kind of the anatomical conditions of the body, I think is not really systematized in the in Malay manuscripts, but it may inform, I think, some of the prescriptions that's being highlighted. So except for Bustana Salatin, which is largely drawn, I think, from Islamic medicine, anatomy is not a big thing in Malay medicine, at least in the kitab you have read. Oh, and I think that's so kind of relating to the quick question in the comments. Is there a wide difference between Islamic medicine and Malay or Javanese medical traditions? I can't speak about Javanese, but I think that between Islamic and Malay, broad commonality, they're kind of subscribed to the same sort of humoral understanding of the body. Differences then lie between the ideas of what constitutes correct conduct, what constitutes what rituals that accompany herbal interventions and so on, and also in the plants that we actually use. So there are a lot of importation of pharmacopoeia, I think, from Islamic medicine we can find some examples of that in Malay medicine, and I think also vice versa, camphor being kind of one of that's used in both, right? So differences mainly in botanicals and practice of particular philosophies and the kind of deities that things applicated to, but similar overall system.
Great, thank you so much, Faiza. Thank you for finally plugging in there, Omar. That was lovely and great to hear about your own practice and you continuing the legacy of your mother. I think I want to thank Faiza again for taking the time to share. but maybe I should kick it over to you, Gandhi, for any kind of final points on the seminar series. Thanks again, Faiza, for doing this and for answering all the questions and just sharing all your knowledge about domestic medicine and your ongoing project. I think it's fascinating and something that we can all benefit from, I think, being here in Singapore. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for Dr. Faiza and then Dr. Medrano for your help again. So we will see the next talk, supposed to be next month on 18 May 2021. Please participate. It's a very interesting talk also. So Timothy P. Barnett is sharing the one about the monkeys in the garden. Please enroll. We are going to send out the invitation by tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Can I say one last thing while we have, there's still quite a number of people on. I should have checked with you first, Faiza, but I'm just gonna throw this out there. If anybody has a story like Omar or a connection like Omar, could I suggest maybe you get in touch with Faiza? Because I think her team would just love to know this information, and maybe like she can get some of her students to go and talk to you and learn more about your own family story and your own family tradition. So if you've got that kind of, background, such as Omar does, please reach out to Professor Faiza Zakaria at NTU. And I think this would really help her project and her students. And that's it. Yeah, sorry, I should have asked first, Faiza, but.
Oh, no, I think it's great. And I definitely want to get in touch with Sarah and Channel. Thank you for the email, by the way. Yeah, so it'll be great kind of to develop, I think, the practitioner lens into domestic medicine, even in contemporary periods. And yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.